August 7th,
Keep your eyes sharp,
1942.
they're out there.
Guadalcanal, Solomon
I
Islands.
see movement near the riverbank.
Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki studied intelligence reports at his headquarters on Truk, preparing for what his superiors
Halt.
assured him would be a
Listen.
straightforward mission. American Marines had landed on Guadalcanal, seizing the partially completed airfield that Japanese construction battalions had
Eyes
been building for months.
narrowed into the dark.
Ichiki's orders were simple. Retake the airfield with his 28th Infantry Regiment, veterans of the Manchurian campaigns who had never known defeat. Japanese intelligence estimated the American landing force at approximately 2,000 men, poorly supplied, isolated
They
from
brought
reinforcement,
everything.
and, most critically,
An
soft.
unstoppable force.
Products of a democratic
This
society
is
that
just the
valued
beginning.
individual comfort over collective sacrifice. The operation should require no more than a few days. Within 2 weeks, Ichiki would be dead, his regiment annihilated, and every assumption the Imperial Japanese Army had made about American fighting capability would lie shattered alongside 900 Japanese corpses on the banks of the Iwo River. The mathematics of that engagement, 900 Japanese dead against 35 Marine casualties, would initiate a crisis of confidence among Japanese military planners.
If you found this story valuable, a like helps us share more forgotten chapters of history with those who appreciate them. Subscribe if you'd like to see more. Each story we uncover matters, and your support makes it possible to keep these voices from the past alive.
That would deepen with every subsequent island battle until the final collapse of Japanese resistance in August 1945. The 1st Marine Division that had landed on Guadalcanal numbered approximately 16,000 men under Major General Alexander Vandegrift, not the 2,000 that Japanese intelligence had estimated. But the numerical error, significant as it was, mattered less than the categorical error that shaped Japanese tactical planning. Imperial Japanese Army doctrine held certain truths about American soldiers as axiomatic, assumptions derived from cultural analysis, propaganda, and the confident belief that warrior spirit determined military outcomes regardless of material factors. American soldiers, according to this doctrine, were individualistic rather than collective in orientation. They valued personal survival over mission accomplishment. They feared close combat, preferring to rely on firepower rather than cold steel. Most critically, they lacked the spiritual foundation that made Japanese soldiers willing to die for their emperor and nation. These assessments had been institutionalized through training materials, intelligence estimates, and command assumptions that shaped operational planning across the Pacific Theater. Ichiki's tactical plan for recapturing Henderson Field reflected these assumptions with precision. He would land his advanced detachment of approximately 900 men east of the marine perimeter, approach through jungle terrain that Americans supposedly could not navigate effectively, and launch a night assault across the Iwo River. Japanese doctrine held that Americans feared darkness, that they would panic when attacked at night, that their defensive positions would crumble under the psychological pressure of screaming attackers emerging from the jungle. The Marines would break. The airfield would fall. Ichiki would report success to his superiors and await the arrival of additional forces to consolidate the victory. The night of August 20th, 1942, provided the first comprehensive test of Japanese assumptions against American reality. Ichiki's force approached the marine perimeter shortly after midnight, moving through jungle that intelligence had assured him Americans could not effectively patrol. Marine listening posts detected the approach. Rather than withdrawing in confusion, as doctrine predicted, the Marines held position and reported contact through radio communications that coordinated defensive preparations across the threatened sector. By the time Ichiki's men reached the east bank of the Iwo River, Marines of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines had established interlocking fields of fire covering every approach. The assault commenced at approximately 01:30 hours. Japanese soldiers waded into the river, bayonets fixed, voices raised in the battle cries that had terrorized Chinese defenders across Manchuria and North China. The psychological warfare tactics that had broken enemy formations through sheer ferocity met a defensive line that didn't break. Machine guns opened fire at predetermined ranges. Mortars dropped illumination rounds that revealed Japanese soldiers silhouetted against the water. Rifle fire, carefully aimed rather than panicked, dropped attackers in the shallows. The Marines held their positions precisely as training had prepared them to do, firing, reloading, adjusting aim to engage targets that Japanese doctrine insisted would send them fleeing into the jungle. The first wave died in the river. A second wave followed, climbing over the bodies of the fallen. They died too. Ichiki committed his reserves, sending every available man into an attack that should have overwhelmed defenders whose cultural weakness made them incapable of sustained resistance. By dawn, Japanese bodies choked the Ilu River for 100 meters upstream and downstream of the crossing point. Then the Marines counterattacked. This violated every Japanese assumption about American tactical behavior. Defenders who had held against night assault should have remained in position, grateful to have survived, consolidating their positions against the possibility of renewed attack. Instead, elements of the 1st Marines crossed the river and began systematically destroying Japanese survivors trapped in a coconut grove on the east bank. Tanks from the 1st Tank Battalion, light M3 Stuart tanks that should have been vulnerable to determined infantry assault, advanced through Japanese positions while infantry followed, eliminating resistance with grenades, automatic weapons, and the bayonets that Doctrine insisted Americans feared to use. By mid-morning on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru, misnamed for a nearby river, actually fought at the Ilu, had ended. Of Ichiki's 900 men, approximately 800 lay dead. Marine casualties totaled 35 killed, with roughly 45 wounded. Colonel Ichiki survived the battle, but not its consequences. According to various accounts, he burned his regimental colors and died by his own hand rather than report the magnitude of his defeat. The battle's statistics reached Japanese headquarters on Rabaul within days, transmitted by surviving officers who had remained with the rear echelon. The reports initiated a pattern of disbelief, rationalization, and eventual acceptance that would repeat with every subsequent encounter between Japanese forces and American Marines. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commanding the 8th Fleet from Rabaul, initially dismissed the casualty figures as communication errors or exaggeration born of shock. The ratios were simply impossible given everything Japanese military science understood about comparative fighting qualities. When confirmation arrived through multiple channels, Mikawa ordered a comprehensive intelligence assessment of Marine capabilities that would consume significant staff resources over the following months. The resulting analysis, compiled from interrogation of captured Marines, examination of American equipment, and systematic observation of Marine tactical methods, reached conclusions that contradicted institutional assumptions but could not be ignored. Japanese intelligence officers documented their findings with the precision that military bureaucracy demanded, creating records that would survive the war and provide historians with detailed evidence of how Japanese perceptions evolved under the pressure of combat reality. The Marines, these reports noted, underwent training that exceeded Japanese expectations in both intensity and duration. Boot camp lasted 8 weeks, a figure Japanese analysts found surprising given assumptions about American aversion to hardship, during which recruits experienced systematic physical and psychological conditioning that produced results disturbingly similar to Japanese training outcomes. The Americans had not copied Bushido. They had independently developed methods that created soldiers willing to die for their unit, their corps, and their mission. One captured Marine, interrogated at length by Japanese intelligence officers, provided descriptions of training that reportedly disturbed his questioners. The systematic breakdown of civilian identity, the physical punishment that pushed recruits beyond perceived limits, the psychological pressure that made surrender inconceivable. These elements paralleled Japanese training methods, but occurred within a framework of material abundance that Japan could not match. Marines emerged from training not only willing to die, but equipped with weapons, ammunition, and support systems that made their sacrifice devastatingly effective. The intelligence assessment circulated through command channels with a classification that reflected its sensitivity. Senior officers needed to understand what their forces would face. Junior officers and enlisted men would continue receiving propaganda that described Americans as soft and cowardly. The disconnect between institutional knowledge and official messaging would persist throughout the war, contributing to tactical decisions that sent Japanese soldiers into engagements based on assumptions their own intelligence services had discredited. Guadalcanal continued demonstrating Marine capabilities through the autumn and early winter of 1942-43. Japanese forces launched multiple attempts to retake Henderson Field, each incorporating lessons from previous failures, each discovering new dimensions of Marine effectiveness that intelligence had not anticipated. The Battle of Edson's Ridge in September 1942 provided another comprehensive demonstration. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's force of approximately 3,000 men attacked Marine positions defending the southern approach to Henderson Field over 2 nights of intensive combat. Kawaguchi had studied Ichiki's failure and adjusted his tactics accordingly, employing multiple approach routes, coordinating his assault with more sophisticated fire support, and attacking positions he believed weaker than those that had destroyed Ichiki's regiment. The 1st Marine Raider Battalion and 1st Marine Parachute Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, held a ridge line that became the focal point of Japanese assault. The fighting reached intensities that Japanese officers later described as exceeding anything they had experienced in China, with positions changing hands multiple times through the night as Marine counterattacks retook ground that Japanese assault had temporarily seized. Japanese accounts of Edson's Ridge, compiled from survivor testimony and captured documents, emphasized characteristics that violated doctrinal expectations. Marines fought at night with effectiveness that Japanese soldiers found disorienting. Units that should have collapsed after taking significant casualties instead reorganized under fire and continued resistance. Junior leaders, sergeants and corporals, made tactical decisions and executed maneuvers that Japanese doctrine reserved for commissioned officers, demonstrating initiative and authority that compressed the American decision cycle to speeds Japanese forces could not match. Kawaguchi's assault ultimately failed at cost of approximately 850 Japanese dead against fewer than 200 Marine casualties. The survivors withdrew into the jungle, carrying reports of an enemy that combined material superiority with fighting spirit that matched their own. The dual advantage proved impossible to overcome through tactical adaptation. The pattern established at the Tanaru and Edson's Ridge repeated with grim consistency throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces launched coordinated offensives in October and November 1942, committing thousands of men to operations that planners expected would finally overwhelm American defenders through superior numbers and determination. Each offensive achieved local successes that Japanese commanders initially interpreted as breakthroughs. Each ultimately failed against Marine defensive positions that held, counterattacked, and destroyed Japanese formations that should have been celebrating victory. The casualty arithmetic accumulated into statistics that Japanese logistics officers found difficult to reconcile with strategic planning assumptions. By the time Japanese forces evacuated Guadalcanal in February 1943, approximately 25,000 Japanese soldiers had died from combat, disease, and starvation. Marine losses totaled approximately 5,600 killed in action, with several thousand additional wounded. The exchange ratios varied by engagement, but the overall pattern was unmistakable. Japanese forces were suffering casualties disproportionate to anything pre-war planning had anticipated against American opponents. More disturbing than the casualty figures was the qualitative assessment that survivors provided to intelligence officers compiling after-action reports. The Marines, these accounts consistently noted, did not behave as Americans were supposed to behave. They did not retreat when surrounded. They did not surrender when their positions became tactically hopeless. They fought at night with effectiveness that neutralized one of Japan's traditional advantages. They accepted casualty rates that should have destroyed unit cohesion, then continued attacking with intensity that suggested the losses had strengthened rather than weakened their determination. One Japanese officer's assessment, captured in a report that reached Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, articulated the problem with clarity that institutional assumptions made difficult to acknowledge. The American Marines represent something we did not anticipate in our strategic calculations. They possess the warrior spirit we believed was uniquely Japanese, combined with industrial resources we cannot match. The combination creates an enemy against whom our traditional advantages provide no decisive benefit. This assessment, buried in classified reports that never reached the Japanese public or lower-ranking military personnel, captured a truth that would shape the remainder of the Pacific War. The Marines had demonstrated at Guadalcanal that American military capability extended beyond material abundance, to include fighting qualities that matched Japanese standards of courage and determination. The assumption that spirit would overcome industrial disadvantage, the foundation of Japanese strategic planning since the decision for war, had collapsed under the weight of evidence that American spirit was equal to Japanese spirit, while American industry remained vastly superior. The intelligence documents that recorded Japanese observations of Marine capabilities through the Guadalcanal campaign reveal an analytical sophistication that coexisted uneasily with propaganda narratives and institutional resistance to unwelcome conclusions. Japanese officers documented Marine tactics with professional precision, noting the interlocking fields of fire that made frontal assault costly, the immediate counterattacks that prevented Japanese forces from consolidating territorial gains, the communication systems that coordinated defensive responses faster than Japanese command structures could adapt. They documented Marine equipment with equal precision, cataloging the weapons and support systems that multiplied individual Marine effectiveness. The M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle gave Marines firepower advantages over Japanese soldiers carrying bolt-action Arisaka rifles. The Browning automatic rifle provided squad-level automatic fire capability that Japanese infantry doctrine had no effective counter for. Artillery support, naval gunfire, and close air support from Henderson Field created a combined arms capability that made Marine positions progressively more lethal as defensive infrastructure developed. Most significantly, they documented the Marine replacement system that maintained unit strength despite casualties that should have degraded combat effectiveness. Wounded Marines were evacuated to hospital ships, treated with medical capabilities that Japanese forces couldn't match, and returned to duty or replaced by fresh personnel from training facilities operating at industrial scale across the United States. Japanese units that suffered comparable casualties simply ceased to exist as effective formations. Marine units regenerated, maintaining strength levels that made attrition warfare favor the defender rather than the attacker. The lessons of Guadalcanal spread through Japanese military channels during 1943, shaping defensive preparations for the island campaigns that Allied forces would launch across the Central and Southwest Pacific. Intelligence officers briefed garrison commanders on Marine capabilities, providing detailed guidance that acknowledged realities propaganda continued to deny. These briefings, preserved in documents captured during subsequent operations, reveal how thoroughly Japanese professional military assessment had diverged from public messaging about American weakness. One such document, recovered from Japanese positions on Tarawa following the November 1943 assault, provided guidance that would have seemed defeatist if distributed to ordinary soldiers. When defending against Marine assault, do not expect them to retreat. Do not assume casualties will degrade their morale. Do not believe superiority in numbers provides advantage, as their firepower negates numerical superiority. Do not attempt traditional night attacks, as Marines fight effectively in darkness. The guidance continued with tactical recommendations that reflected lessons learned at terrible cost on Guadalcanal. The only effective defense is prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire, multiple fallback positions prepared in advance, and the understanding that the position will eventually fall. The goal is not to stop the Marines, but to exact maximum casualties before the position is overrun. This evolution from confident expectation of victory to calculated preparation for inevitable defeat occurred within 18 months of the first Marine landing on Guadalcanal. The transformation reflected not just tactical adjustment, but fundamental reassessment of the strategic assumptions that had shaped Japanese war planning. The Americans were not soft. The Marines were not cowards. The combination of warrior spirit and industrial capacity that Japanese officers observed on Guadalcanal would prove decisive across every subsequent campaign, creating an enemy against whom courage alone could never be sufficient. The Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal carried their experiences to subsequent assignments, spreading knowledge that contradicted official propaganda through informal channels that military bureaucracy could not control. Corporals who had watched Marine machine gunners continue firing with catastrophic wounds told their stories to replacements who would face Marines on other islands. Sergeants who had seen Marine counterattacks emerge from positions that should have been neutralized prepared their squads for realities that training manuals didn't describe. The institutional knowledge accumulated through thousands of individual experiences, creating an understanding of Marine capabilities that existed parallel to official assessments that continued describing Americans as fundamentally inferior opponents. By early 1943, Japanese forces preparing to defend islands across the Pacific knew that they would eventually face an enemy that their own intelligence services had characterized as combining Japanese fighting spirit with American industrial resources. They knew that no defensive position could hold indefinitely against such an opponent. They understood that their mission was not to achieve victory, but to make victory as expensive as possible, hoping that accumulated casualties might convince American leadership to negotiate rather than continue paying the price the Marines were willing to pay. This strategic recalculation, born from the shock of Guadalcanal, would shape Japanese defensive operations through the remainder of the war. The confidence that had characterized Japanese military planning in December 1941 had given way to the grim arithmetic of attrition warfare against an opponent who could accept losses and continue attacking, who could regenerate destroyed units while Japanese units remained destroyed, who possessed both the will and the means to fight until every Japanese defender was dead or captured. The Marines who had landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942 had proven something that Japanese strategic planning had considered impossible. Americans could match Japanese soldiers in courage while exceeding them in every material dimension of warfare. That combination, first demonstrated in the jungle and rivers of Guadalcanal, would prove decisive across every island battle that followed. November 20th, 1943. 6:13 a.m. Tarawa Atoll, Gilbert Islands. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki surveyed his defensive preparations from the command bunker on Betio Island with the confidence of a commander who had studied his enemy and prepared accordingly. The island measured barely 3,000 yards long and 800 yards wide at its broadest point, a speck of coral and sand that Japanese engineers had transformed into what Shibasaki reportedly described as a fortress that would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to conquer. 4,500 Japanese defenders occupied positions that interlocking fields of fire made mutually supporting. Concrete bunkers with walls 4 feet thick housed machine guns and artillery pieces. The beach approaches were mined, strung with barbed wire, and covered by weapons registered to deliver devastating fire on any point where landing craft might approach. Shibasaki had reviewed intelligence reports documenting Marine capabilities on Guadalcanal. He understood that the Americans would not break under psychological pressure, that they would accept casualties his defenses would inflict, that their assault would continue regardless of losses until either his defenders or their attackers were eliminated. His defensive plan incorporated these realities. He had positioned his forces not to repel the Marines, that had proven impossible against properly supplied American forces, but to make them pay a price in blood that might give Japan strategic leverage for negotiated peace. The mathematics Shibasaki calculated were straightforward. His 4,500 defenders, properly dug in, should inflict casualties at ratios of 3-to-1 or better against amphibious assault. If Marines landed 10,000 men, 3,000 should fall, taking Betio. Such losses, sustained across the Pacific island chain, would eventually exhaust American willingness to continue offensive operations. Japan couldn't win the war outright, but perhaps the cumulative cost would prove unbearable. What Shibasaki's calculations didn't account for was the American willingness to pay exactly the price he intended to extract, absorb those losses without operational pause, and continue advancing on schedule regardless of the human cost. The 2nd Marine Division began landing operations at 9 a.m. after a naval bombardment that should have suppressed defensive fire but left Shibasaki's fortifications largely intact. The bombardment's apparent effectiveness had masked a miscalculation that would prove costly. An unusually low tide had left the reef surrounding Betio exposed, forcing landing craft to ground hundreds of yards from shore. Marines who should have reached the beach in armored vehicles instead waded through chest-deep water under fire from positions the bombardment had failed to destroy. The first wave suffered catastrophic casualties. Machine gun fire swept across Marines struggling through the lagoon, their progress measured in yards purchased with lives. Landing craft that attempted to cross the reef grounded on coral, becoming stationary targets for Japanese gunners who had registered every approach. Bodies accumulated in the water, on the reef, along the seawall that survivors reached, only to discover they couldn't advance further against the fire pouring from bunkers just yards away. By noon, the situation appeared desperate to observers on the command ships offshore. Reports reaching Major General Julian Smith, commanding the 2nd Marine Division, described fragmented units, destroyed communications, and casualty rates that exceeded any previous Marine operation. The carefully planned assault had devolved into isolated groups of survivors clinging to a seawall, while Japanese fire prevented any organized movement. Japanese defenders, observing from their bunkers, initially believed they were witnessing the fulfillment of Shibasaki's predictions. The Marines had been stopped at the waterline. Hundreds lay dead in the lagoon and on the beach. The assault appeared to be failing in ways that validated every calculation about defensive firepower overcoming offensive determination. Then the Marines demonstrated the characteristic that Japanese intelligence had documented, but Japanese tactical planning had consistently underestimated. They kept coming. Reinforcement waves landed throughout the afternoon, wading through the same killing ground that had consumed the morning assault, taking casualties at rates that should have halted any rational military operation, reaching the beach with numbers sufficient to continue the attack. Junior officers and sergeants organized survivors into ad hoc assault teams. Naval gunfire, finally adjusted to engage specific Japanese positions, began systematic reduction of bunkers that had dominated the beach. By nightfall, Marines held a precarious beachhead perhaps 50 yards deep, purchased at cost of over 1,000 casualties in a single day. The second day brought renewed assault against positions that Shibasaki had designed to resist exactly this kind of pressure. Marines employed demolition charges, flamethrowers, and point-blank gunfire to reduce bunkers that conventional weapons couldn't penetrate. Each position fell only after close-quarters combat that produced casualties on both sides. The advance measured in tens of yards per hour, each yard requiring Marines to assault fortifications their commanders had expected naval bombardment to neutralize. By the morning of the third day, November 22nd, the outcome had become mathematically certain despite the tactical uncertainties that remained. Marine reinforcements continued arriving while Japanese defenders, cut off from any possibility of resupply or reinforcement, expended ammunition they couldn't replace against an enemy they couldn't ultimately stop. Shibasaki himself died sometime during the second day, killed in his command bunker by naval gunfire or demolition. Charges, accounts vary, depriving Japanese defenders of coordination that might have prolonged resistance by hours. The battle ended on November 23rd, 76 hours after the first Marines had waded into the lagoon. Of Shibasaki's 4,500 defenders, approximately 4,700 died, including Korean laborers pressed into defensive service. 17 Japanese soldiers surrendered, most because they were unconscious or too severely wounded to continue resistance. The Marines suffered approximately 1,000 killed and 2,000 wounded from the 18,000 men committed to the operation. The casualty figures that reached American newspapers produced a public reaction that briefly validated Japanese strategic calculations. 1,000 Marines dead in 76 hours to capture an island most Americans couldn't locate on a map generated protests, congressional inquiries, and editorial questioning of whether Pacific objectives justified such cost. For a moment, it appeared that the price Shibasaki had extracted might produce the political consequences Japanese strategists hoped accumulated casualties would eventually create. The American military response demonstrated why those hopes would prove unfounded. Rather than reconsidering offensive operations, American commanders conducted systematic analysis of what had gone wrong at Tarawa and how future operations could be improved. The inadequate naval bombardment led to revised fire support doctrine that would deliver far heavier preparatory fires in subsequent landings. The reef obstacle that had stranded landing craft produced development of amphibious tractors capable of crossing such barriers. The communication failures that had fragmented the assault generated improved radio equipment and procedures. Every lesson Tarawa taught was incorporated into planning for the next operation. The Marines themselves, rather than being demoralized by Tarawa's losses, emerged with institutional knowledge that would make subsequent operations more effective. Veterans who had survived the lagoon crossing trained replacements in techniques that reduced casualties. The doctrine of continuous assault, regardless of losses, was validated as the only approach that produced victory against fortified positions. The price Tarawa extracted became proof that the Marines could pay any price necessary rather than evidence that some prices were too high. Japanese intelligence officers, analyzing reports from Tarawa's few survivors and intercepted American communications, documented conclusions that contradicted the strategic assumptions underlying Japanese defensive planning. One assessment, recovered from captured documents on subsequent operations, articulated the problem with clarity that Tokyo was reluctant to acknowledge. The Marines who assaulted Tarawa suffered casualties that would have rendered any Japanese formation combat ineffective. They absorbed these losses without reduction in offensive intensity. They continued attacking, through fire that killed hundreds. They paid the price our defenses extracted and took the island on their originally planned schedule. This demonstrates that making American operations costly does not make them impossible. The strategy of attrition assumes the enemy will reach a point where losses become unacceptable. The Marines have not demonstrated such a point exists. This assessment, distributed to garrison commanders across the Pacific, provided guidance that acknowledged realities Japanese propaganda continued to deny. Defenders were told to expect Marine assault that would continue regardless of casualties inflicted, to prepare positions for eventual overrun rather than permanent defense, to measure success in time delayed and enemies killed rather than territory held. The strategic framework had shifted from defeating American operations to making those operations as expensive as possible in hopes that accumulated cost would eventually produce negotiated peace. The operations that followed Tarawa demonstrated both the effectiveness and the limitations of this revised strategy. The Marshall Islands campaign in January and February 1944 applied lessons learned at Tarawa to produce victories achieved at significantly lower cost. Kwajalein Atoll fell in 4 days with Marine and Army casualties totaling approximately 370 killed. Eniwetok required 3 days and cost roughly 260 American dead. Japanese defenders, numbering over 8,000 across the Marshall Islands, died almost to the last man while inflicting casualty ratios far less favorable than Shibasaki had achieved. The Mariana Islands campaign of summer 1944 raised the stakes and the intensity of combat. Saipan, defended by approximately 30,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, represented the first objective in Japan's inner defensive perimeter, territory close enough to the home islands that its loss would bring American bombers within range of Tokyo. The strategic significance guaranteed desperate resistance that would test Marine capabilities at scale exceeding any previous operation. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions landed on Saipan on June 15, 1944, initiating a campaign that would last 3 weeks and cost over 3,400 American dead from approximately 71,000 committed. Japanese casualties exceeded 29,000 killed, including General Saito and Admiral Chuechi Nagumo, the Pearl Harbor commander who had been assigned to Saipan in what amounted to professional exile. The battle's final phase provided the most comprehensive demonstration of the divergence between Japanese and American approaches to combat that had emerged since Guadalcanal. On July 7th, General Saito ordered what remained of Japanese forces, approximately 3,000 men capable of offensive action, to conduct a final banzai charge against American lines. The attack was not intended to achieve tactical victory. It was intended to die with honor while inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy. The charge struck positions held by elements of the 27th Infantry Division, an Army unit attached to the Marine Corps operation. Japanese soldiers poured into American lines in the pre-dawn darkness, screaming, bayonets fixed, overwhelming forward positions through sheer numbers before American firepower could halt the human wave. The fighting reached intensities that survivors described as among the most savage of the Pacific War, with combat at ranges measured in feet rather than yards. By dawn, approximately 4,300 Japanese attackers lay dead. American casualties totaled roughly 650 killed and wounded. The banzai charge had inflicted losses at ratios of approximately 7-1 in Japan's favor, far better than any defensive engagement had achieved, but had consumed Japanese offensive capability entirely while leaving American units capable of continued operations. The tactic that was supposed to demonstrate Japanese spiritual superiority had instead demonstrated the bankruptcy of exchanging irreplaceable Japanese lives for American casualties that could be replaced within weeks. Documents captured on Saipan following its fall included Japanese intelligence assessments of Marine capabilities that revealed how thoroughly professional military analysis had diverged from propaganda narratives. One report classified Marines as shock troops, displaying fanatical devotion to objectives, noting that Marines refuse orders to retreat and will counterattack even when tactically disadvantaged. Casualties inflicted on Marines do not degrade unit effectiveness until the unit is completely destroyed. This classification emerged from systematic observation across multiple campaigns. Japanese officers had documented Marine behavior patterns that violated everything they had been taught about American military psychology. The willingness to accept casualties without operational pause. The immediate counterattacks that prevented Japanese forces from consolidating gains. The junior leadership that made tactical decisions at speeds Japanese command structures couldn't match. Each observation contributed to an assessment that acknowledged Marines represented something unprecedented in Japanese military experience. Peleliu, in September 1944, provided the final test of Japanese defensive doctrine before the assault on Iwo Jima. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commanding approximately 11,000 defenders, had studied every previous engagement between Japanese forces and American Marines. He had read the intelligence reports documenting Marine capabilities. He had analyzed the failures of banzai charges and the futility of beach defenses against American firepower. His defensive plan reflected everything Japanese military science had learned about fighting an enemy they could not defeat. Nakagawa abandoned the beach defense entirely. He concentrated his forces in a ridge system called the Umurbrugol Mountains by Americans, and provided no Japanese name because the terrain was too rugged for formal designation. He created a defense in depth, utilizing over 500 caves connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to shift position without surface exposure. He positioned artillery to deliver fire on the beaches, then withdrew those guns into caves before American counter-battery fire could destroy them. He trained his men to avoid the massed counterattacks that had wasted Japanese lives on previous islands, instead conducting small unit operations that made maximum use of terrain advantages. The 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu on September 15th, expecting an operation of approximately 4 days based on intelligence assessments of Japanese defensive capability. The Marines reached the beach with acceptable casualties, pushed inland against resistance that seemed manageable, and reported optimistic progress through the first day's fighting. By nightfall, the operation appeared to be proceeding ahead of schedule. The appearance proved disastrously misleading. Over the following weeks, the 1st Marine Division ground itself to pieces against Nakagawa's defenses in combat that defied every assumption about the relationship between offensive capability and defensive preparation. The ridge system absorbed Marine attacks that succeeded tactically but achieved nothing strategically, taking individual positions only to discover more positions behind them, eliminating defending units only to find fresh defenders had occupied adjacent caves through tunnel connections American forces couldn't detect. The casualty rates exceeded anything the Marine Corps had previously experienced in sustained operations. The 1st Marine Division suffered over 6,500 casualties from approximately 9,000 men committed, a casualty rate exceeding 70% that would have destroyed the combat effectiveness of any military formation in history. The division was withdrawn in October, replaced by elements of the 81st Infantry Division that continued operations until Nakagawa's death on November 24th finally ended organized resistance. Nakagawa's defense had achieved exactly what Japanese strategic doctrine intended: casualties so severe that American commanders would reconsider future operations. The 1st Marine Division required months of rebuilding before it could participate in subsequent campaigns. The lessons of Peleliu prompted serious reconsideration of whether certain objectives justified the cost of assault. Yet even Peleliu ultimately demonstrated the futility of Japanese strategy. The island fell. Every Japanese defender died except for a handful who surrendered or were captured wounded. American forces absorbed losses that should have been prohibitive and continued Pacific operations without operational pause. The price Nakagawa extracted delayed, but didn't prevent American victory. The mathematics that had seemed to favor defense produced the same outcome as every previous calculation: Japanese defenders dead, American objectives achieved, the war continuing inexorably toward Japanese home islands. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, preparing to defend Iwo Jima through the autumn of 1944, studied Nakagawa's defense with the intensity of a commander who understood he faced the same enemy under similar circumstances. The intelligence reports that reached his headquarters documented everything Marines had demonstrated across 3 years of Pacific combat: the willingness to accept casualties, the firepower that made defensive positions untenable, the junior leadership that exploited opportunities faster than Japanese forces could respond, the replacement system that maintained American strength while Japanese strength declined with every engagement. Kuribayashi's preparations reflected this understanding. He would construct defenses that exceeded anything Nakagawa had achieved on Peleliu. He would train his men to make Marines pay for every meter of ground. He would extract casualties that might prove sufficient to convince American leadership that invasion of Japan itself would cost more than negotiated peace. But Kuribayashi, unlike commanders who had preceded him, harbored no illusions about ultimate outcomes. His communications to Tokyo during the months of preparation acknowledged what official channels were reluctant to state. The Marines would land, they would take Iwo Jima, and the only variable was how many of them would die achieving that inevitable victory. Japanese strategy had evolved from confident expectation of defeating American forces to calculated acceptance that those forces could be bled, but never stopped. The documents that Kuribayashi prepared for his garrison reflected this grim assessment with honesty that official propaganda still denied. His orders acknowledged that Marines would land with overwhelming force, that they would have complete control of sea and air, that they would bring unlimited supplies and reinforcements, that they would attack until Iwo Jima fell. The mission was not to defeat them. That was impossible. The mission was to make victory cost so much that American leadership would reconsider invading Japan. Whether that calculation might have proven correct remained untested. The atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war before any invasion of Japan commenced. But the pattern Kuribayashi anticipated, Marines accepting any cost to achieve objectives, had been demonstrated with brutal consistency from Guadalcanal through Peleliu. The mathematics of attrition that Japanese strategy depended upon assumed some casualties were unacceptable to American forces. The Marines had proven no such limit existed. They would pay whatever price victory required and continue advancing over the bodies of their own dead. This was the enemy that awaited Kuribayashi's carefully prepared defenses, an enemy that Japanese intelligence had documented exhaustively, that Japanese commanders understood with professional clarity, and that Japanese forces could delay but never defeat. The final test of Japanese defensive doctrine would unfold on the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, where everything Japan had learned about fighting Marines would be applied with desperate precision against forces that had proven themselves willing to accept any sacrifice for victory. February 19, 1945, 6:40 a.m., Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi stood in his command bunker beneath the volcanic rock that dominated the island's southern tip, reviewing reports from observation posts that confirmed what radar had detected hours earlier. The American invasion fleet had arrived. Through the pre-dawn darkness, over 450 ships had assembled offshore, carrying approximately 70,000 Marines who would begin landing operations within hours. The moment Kuribayashi had spent 8 months preparing for had finally come. The 53-year-old general represented Japan's most experienced and capable defensive commander, a Harvard-educated officer who had served as military attaché in Washington and understood American capabilities with clarity that few Japanese officers possessed. His preparations for Iwo Jima reflected that understanding. Where previous commanders had positioned forces to repel landings at the waterline, Kuribayashi had constructed a defense in depth that conceded the beaches entirely. Where others had planned banzai charges that wasted Japanese lives, he had explicitly forbidden such attacks. Where conventional doctrine emphasized holding positions until overrun, Kuribayashi had created a defensive system designed to make every meter of ground cost American lives without expecting any position to hold indefinitely. The fortifications his engineers had constructed exceeded anything the Pacific War had produced. 11 miles of tunnels connected over 1,500 cave positions, allowing defenders to shift between fighting positions without surface exposure. Artillery and mortar positions were dug into volcanic rock so thoroughly that preliminary bombardment couldn't reach them. Machine gun bunkers featured walls of reinforced concrete 4 feet thick, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. The beaches themselves were registered for mortar and artillery fire that would transform any landing zone into a killing ground. Kuribayashi had studied every previous engagement between Japanese forces and American Marines. He had read the intelligence assessments documenting Marine capabilities at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu. He understood that his 21,000 defenders faced an enemy that would accept any casualties necessary to achieve objectives, that possessed firepower exceeding his own by factors that made conventional defense impossible, and that would continue attacking until every Japanese soldier was dead or the island was secured. His defensive plan accepted these realities and built strategy around them. His orders to his garrison, distributed in January 1945, acknowledged what official propaganda still denied. "We cannot win this battle," the orders stated according to documents recovered after the fighting ended. "We can only make the Americans pay for every meter of ground. That is our mission. Accept death, inflict casualties, delay their advance. This is how we serve the Empire in its darkest hour. The American preliminary bombardment began at 6:40 a.m. Naval guns from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers delivering fire that should have suppressed defensive positions across the island. For 70 minutes, shells weighing up to 1 ton each struck Iwo Jima's volcanic surface, raising clouds of ash and debris that observers on the command ships interpreted as evidence of comprehensive destruction. Airstrikes added to the bombardment, aircraft from 7 escort carriers delivering bombs and rockets against positions that intelligence had identified through reconnaissance photography. The bombardment accomplished far less than its intensity suggested. Kuribayashi's fortifications, buried beneath volcanic rock that absorbed explosive force, remained largely intact. Artillery pieces had been withdrawn into caves before the bombardment began, protected by overhead cover that naval guns couldn't penetrate. The defenders who would emerge to man positions when the landing commenced had survived in tunnels too deep for any conventional weapon to reach. At 9 a.m., the first waves of Marines from the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions touched the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima's southeastern beaches. The landing craft grounded in soft ash that provided no traction, forcing men to struggle forward through terrain that seemed designed to slow movement and expose attackers. For the first 20 minutes, Japanese positions remained silent, a deliberate tactical choice that allowed Marines to crowd the beaches before defensive fire began. Then Kuribayashi's artillery observers gave the signal, and Iwo Jima became what veterans would later describe as the most concentrated killing ground of the Pacific War. Mortar fire descended on beaches crowded with Marines who had nowhere to take cover. Artillery shells, pre-registered on every landing zone, detonated among men struggling through volcanic ash that reached their knees. Machine gun fire swept across the beach from positions invisible among the volcanic rock. The careful planning that had positioned every weapon to cover specific sectors now demonstrated its effectiveness against targets that couldn't escape the interlocking fields of fire. Casualties accumulated at rates that exceeded even Tarawa's initial hours. Within the first hour, over 2,000 Marines had been killed or wounded. The assault waves that should have pushed inland found themselves pinned against terrain that made advance nearly impossible and retreat unthinkable. The soft volcanic ash absorbed the blast effects that might have created cover, leaving Marines exposed to fire from positions they couldn't locate, much less suppress. The pattern that Kuribayashi had anticipated was unfolding exactly as designed. Marines were dying in numbers that validated every calculation about defensive firepower. The beachhead was becoming a killing ground that concentrated American casualties in ways that previous operations had avoided. For a moment, it appeared that Iwo Jima might accomplish what no previous Japanese defense had achieved, stopping a Marine assault through sheer attrition. Then the Marines demonstrated the characteristic that Kuribayashi had documented but couldn't ultimately counter. They advanced into the fire. Officers and sergeants organized survivors into assault teams that pushed forward despite casualties that should have halted any rational military operation. Naval gunfire, adjusted by forward observers who had survived the landing, began engaging specific defensive positions with precision that the preliminary bombardment had lacked. Tanks that had reached the beach provided direct fire support against bunkers that infantry alone couldn't reduce. The assault that should have stalled on the beaches instead began grinding forward, measuring progress in yards purchased with lives. By nightfall on February 19th, Marines held a beachhead approximately 4,000 yards wide and 700 yards deep at its maximum penetration. The cost had been staggering, over 2,400 casualties in a single day, including 566 killed in action. But the Marines had accomplished what Kuribayashi's defenses were designed to prevent. They had established themselves ashore in strength that subsequent reinforcement would make unassailable. The days that followed provided the most comprehensive test of Japanese defensive doctrine against marine offensive capability that the Pacific War would produce. Kuribayashi's system of tunnels and interconnected positions worked exactly as designed, allowing defenders to shift forces without surface exposure, to appear in positions that Marines had believed secured, to maintain resistance in areas that conventional military analysis would have considered neutralized. The fighting reached intensities that veterans of every previous Pacific battle described as unprecedented. The reduction of Mount Suribachi, the volcanic cone that dominated the island's southern end, illustrated the tactical problem Marines faced and the solutions they developed through experience purchased with casualties. The mountain had been honeycombed with defensive positions, connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to engage Marines from unexpected directions. Artillery and naval gunfire couldn't reach positions buried beneath volcanic rock. Each cave entrance had to be reduced individually through direct assault. Marines developed systematic techniques for cave reduction that balanced effectiveness against the casualties each position extracted. Demolition teams approached, undercovering fire to place explosive charges against cave entrances. Flamethrowers, the M22 portable units, and the larger M4A3R3 Sherman-mounted systems delivered burning fuel into positions that explosives couldn't reach. When caves proved too deep for direct attack, engineers sealed entrances with demolition charges or bulldozed volcanic debris over openings, entombing defenders who couldn't be reached by other means. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi on February 23rd, the iconic image that would come to symbolize Marine sacrifice in the Pacific, marked not the end of the battle but barely its beginning. The mountain's fall secured the southern end of the island, but left the main defensive complex in the north untouched. There, in terrain even more favorable to defense than Suribachi had provided, Kuribayashi had concentrated the bulk of his forces in positions designed to exact maximum casualties from any American advance. The fighting for the northern plateau consumed 3 additional weeks of combat that produced casualties at rates exceeding any sustained operation in Marine Corps history. The defensive system that Kuribayashi had created forced Marines to reduce each position individually, to advance across terrain that channeled attackers into killing zones, to accept losses that mounted daily without any apparent reduction in Japanese resistance. The progress measured in tens of yards per day, each advance requiring Marines to assault fortifications that their commanders had expected weeks of preliminary bombardment to neutralize. Japanese defensive positions demonstrated the integration of terrain, fortification, and tactical doctrine that Kuribayashi had refined through months of preparation. Machine gun bunkers were positioned not for maximum individual field of fire, but to create interlocking zones where attackers came under fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Artillery was registered on approaches that Marines had to use regardless of the fire awaiting them. Mortars delivered supporting fire from positions invisible among the volcanic rock, their crews connected by telephone to observers who called adjustments with the precision that extended combat experience provided. The system extracted casualties at rates that previous operations hadn't approached. The 4th Marine Division, which had landed with approximately 24,000 men, suffered over 9,000 casualties by the time Iwo Jima was secured, a rate exceeding 37% that would have rendered most military formations combat ineffective. The 5th Marine Division absorbed comparable losses. The 3rd Marine Division, committed as reinforcement, suffered casualties that brought total American losses to over 26,000 from the 70,000 men who participated in the operation. Yet the Marines never paused. Reinforcements arrived to replace casualties. Units that had been ground down through weeks of combat were pulled back, reorganized, and returned to the assault. The offensive tempo that Kuribayashi had designed his defenses to disrupt continued without reduction from the first day's landing to the final collapse of Japanese resistance. The mathematics of attrition that Japanese strategy depended upon assumed some level of casualties would prove unacceptable. The Marines demonstrated that no such level existed for objectives they had been ordered to take. Kuribayashi himself observed this pattern from his command bunker as the battle progressed, documenting observations and communications to Tokyo that would provide the most comprehensive Japanese assessment of Marine capabilities produced during the war. His messages, transmitted through increasingly desperate conditions as American forces closed on his position, articulated conclusions that no Japanese commander had previously stated so directly. The Marines are the most effective fighting force I have encountered. They possess several attributes that make them uniquely dangerous. First, their training creates soldiers willing to accept casualties that would break other units. Second, their firepower exceeds ours by a factor of 5 to 1 in artillery and 10 to 1 in air support. Third, their junior leaders make decisions at squad level that our officers make at company level, allowing them to exploit opportunities faster than we can react. Fourth, and most critical, they never stop attacking. There is no defense that can survive this combination indefinitely. This assessment, transmitted to Imperial General Headquarters in early March, captured truths that Japanese strategic planning had been reluctant to acknowledge since Guadalcanal. The Marines represented not merely American military capability, but American industrial philosophy applied to warfare. The systematic application of overwhelming force to every tactical problem. The replacement of irreplaceable casualties with fresh personnel trained to identical standards. The continuation of offensive operations regardless of cost, because American resources made any cost sustainable. The combined arms coordination that Kuribayashi documented reflected 3 years of refinement that had transformed Marine operations from the improvised assaults of Guadalcanal into systematic methodology. When Marine infantry encountered fortified positions, the response followed established patterns that compressed decision-making cycles to speeds Japanese defenders couldn't match. Squad leaders called for supporting fire. Forward observers directed naval gunfire against positions beyond the range of organic weapons. Tanks provided direct fire support while infantry maneuvered. Aircraft delivered bombs and napalm against targets that ground weapons couldn't reach. This coordination occurred at junior leadership levels that Japanese military hierarchy couldn't replicate. American sergeants exercised authority that Japanese doctrine reserved for commissioned officers. Corporals made tactical decisions that Japanese forces required approval from company commanders to implement. The result was an enemy that adapted to changing conditions faster than Japanese defensive plans could accommodate, exploiting weaknesses before Japanese commanders recognized they existed, concentrating force against vulnerable points that Japanese doctrine assumed would have time to prepare. The authority delegated to junior Marine leaders reflected both training philosophy and communications technology that Japanese forces lacked. Every Marine rifle squad possessed radio capability that connected it to supporting arms. Fire support requests moved from frontline riflemen to naval guns miles offshore in minutes, rather than the hours Japanese communications required. The informational advantage amplified the material advantage, creating an enemy that seemed to possess nearly perfect situational awareness, while Japanese defenders operated with fragmentary knowledge of conditions beyond their immediate positions. Japanese soldiers who survived long enough to observe Marine operations documented characteristics that contradicted the propaganda they had been taught to believe. The Americans were not soft. They endured conditions that tested Japanese soldiers' limits. Weeks of continuous combat, inadequate sleep, temperatures that reached over 100 degrees during the day and dropped below 50 at night, volcanic fumes that irritated lungs and eyes, terrain that made every movement exhausting. Marines operated under these conditions while maintaining offensive pressure that never relented. The logistical support that sustained Marine operations particularly impressed Japanese observers accustomed to the deprivation that characterized their own experience. Fresh water, adequate food, medical supplies, and ammunition arrived continuously despite the combat that raged across the island. Wounded Marines received treatment within minutes of being hit, evacuation to hospital ships within hours. medical care that saved lives at rates Japanese forces couldn't approach. The contrast between American abundance and Japanese scarcity, visible in every dimension of operations, demonstrated the industrial disparity that no amount of courage could overcome. By mid-March, Kuribayashi's command had fragmented into isolated pockets, resisting without coordination as American forces systematically reduced each defensive complex. The tunnel system that had allowed defenders to shift forces without surface exposure had been breached in multiple locations, cutting communication lines and preventing the coordinated defense that had characterized the battle's early weeks. Individual positions continued fighting, some until late March, a few holdouts for months afterward. But organized resistance had effectively ended. Kuribayashi himself disappeared from Japanese communications in late March, his death documented only by absence. Various accounts describe him leading a final assault, dying in his command bunker, or committing suicide to avoid capture. The uncertainty reflects the chaos that characterized the battle's final days, when Japanese command structure had disintegrated into individuals and small groups fighting without direction until death or capture. His body was never conclusively identified among the thousands of Japanese dead that American burial details would enter in mass graves across the island. The final statistics from Iwo Jima documented the mathematical reality that both sides had calculated differently, but that combat had resolved definitively. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, approximately 20,000 died. Fewer than 1,100 were captured, most because they were unconscious, too severely wounded to resist, or had surrendered during the battle's chaotic final days. The Marines suffered approximately 26,000 casualties from 70,000 men committed, over 6,800 killed, approximately 19,200 wounded. The casualty rate approached 40%, unprecedented for any sustained Marine operation. Yet the mathematics that seemed to validate Japanese strategy ultimately proved its failure. Iwo Jima fell on schedule despite casualties that should have halted the operation. The Marine divisions that had been ground down through 5 weeks of combat were reconstituted within months and participated in subsequent operations. The price that Kuribayashi extracted delayed nothing, prevented nothing, accomplished nothing beyond the death of his garrison. The Marines had paid what Japanese defenses demanded and continued their advance toward Japan itself. The lessons that Japanese military leadership drew from Iwo Jima shaped preparations for the defense of the home islands that surrender would ultimately prevent. Intelligence assessments distributed to commanders responsible for defending Kyushu and Honshu documented Marine capabilities with the precision that 3 years of combat experience had provided. The Americans would land with overwhelming force. They would accept casualties at rates that previous military experience suggested were impossible. They would continue attacking until every defender was dead or the objective was secured. The assessments provided tactical guidance that reflected complete abandonment of any hope for victory. Defenders should prepare positions for eventual overrun rather than permanent defense. They should extract maximum casualties during the time available. They should understand that their sacrifice would buy time for diplomatic negotiations that might preserve something of Japan as a nation. There was honor in this sacrifice even without victory. These were the terms that Japanese military planners used to prepare for defending their homeland against Marines, whose capabilities they had finally learned to assess accurately. Post-war interrogations of Japanese veterans who had faced Marines across the Pacific produced testimonies that confirmed what intelligence assessments had documented. The Marines represented something Japanese military culture had claimed exclusively for itself: warrior spirit combined with determination to fight to death rather than accept defeat, while possessing material resources that Japan could never match. The combination had proven unbeatable. One veteran, captured on Okinawa after surviving encounters with Marines on 3 previous islands, articulated the conclusion that Japanese soldiers had reached through accumulated experience. "We were taught that spirit conquers material, that our will to die made us invincible. The Marines taught us that spirit plus material conquers spirit alone. They were as willing to die as we were. But they had tanks and naval gunfire and unlimited ammunition and air supremacy and medical care and food and all the resources of America behind them. We had our rifles and our courage. That was not enough. It was never going to be enough. Kuribayashi's final assessment, transmitted to Tokyo before his death, provided the professional military judgment that propaganda had obscured throughout the war. The Marines will come. You cannot stop them. You can only make them pay in blood for every meter of ground. Perhaps if the price is high enough, they will negotiate rather than destroy everything. That is our only hope. That hope died with the atomic bombs in August. But Kuribayashi's assessment of Marine capabilities proved accurate across every engagement from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. They were the instrument that broke Japanese defensive lines throughout the Pacific. They paid prices that would have destroyed lesser organizations. They never broke, never retreated, never failed to take an objective they had been ordered to secure. The statistical record supports this conclusion with numerical precision that requires no interpretation. Marines fought in every major Pacific campaign from August 1942 to August 1945. They suffered approximately 87,000 casualties, including nearly 20,000 killed. They never failed to take an objective, never abandoned a position once captured, never gave Japanese forces any evidence that Marines could be defeated through superior determination or tactical skill. The price was terrible. The results were absolute. The Japanese soldiers who faced Marines across the Pacific learned through combat what their intelligence services had documented, but their propaganda had denied. The Americans had created fighting forces that combined everything Japan claimed for its own warriors with everything Japan's industrial base could never provide. Against such an enemy, courage alone could never be sufficient. The mathematics of industrial warfare, expressed through Marines willing to die and equipped with resources to make their sacrifice decisive, determined outcomes that no amount of Japanese determination could alter. The documents that survived the war, the intelligence assessments, the command communications, the diaries and letters of soldiers on both sides, record the evolution of Japanese understanding from confident expectation of victory to calculated acceptance of inevitable defeat. That evolution occurred across 3 years and dozens of islands, written in casualties that mounted with each engagement until the final accounting on Iwo Jima demonstrated what Japanese commanders had finally learned to accept. The Marines would pay any price to achieve their objectives, and Japan possessed no defense that could make that price too high.